The house had been vacant for nearly a decade when Marcus and his girlfriend, Elise, decided to move in. Rent in their city was crushing, and when Elise's cousin offered them the old family home on Granger Street for free, as long as they were willing to fix it up, it seemed like a blessing. The house was big, much larger than they were used to. For bedrooms, creaky wood floors, and a wide basement that Elise warned was not in the best shape. The neighbors kept their distance when the couple moved in, watching silently from behind lace curtains, as though they knew something the two newcomers didn't. The couple laughed it off. Old houses had history, sure, but nothing they couldn't handle. The basement, however, carried a different presence. On their first night, Marcus ventured down with a flashlight, only to be met by a damp, metallic odor that clung to his clothes long after he came back up. The floor was concrete, cracked in jagged lines like veins, and the brick walls sweated with condensation. Rusted shelves leaned against one wall, filled with abandoned jars of nails, screws, and what looked like tiny animal bones. It just needs work, Marcus told himself. But as he stood there, light trembling against the damp walls, he had the distinct sensation that the shadows weren't entirely empty. He rushed back upstairs, locking the door behind him without thinking. Over the next few days, the house settled into its rhythms, pipes groaning, wood snapping, wind sliding through thin cracks. But the basement door became a silent centerpiece of their unease. Elise, who usually brushed off Marcus's nervousness, admitted she didn't like being near it. "It's colder there," she whispered once, after brushing her hand along the doorframe. She was right. The hallway could be warm, but the air around that door clung with an unnatural chill, as though the basement itself exhaled through the wood. Neither of them had spoken of it directly, but an unspoken agreement formed. They wouldn't go back down there unless they absolutely had to. On the fifth night, Marcus woke to a noise he couldn't place. Elise was still asleep beside him, her breathing soft and steady. The noise came again, a hollow thud, followed by a dragging scrape. It wasn't upstairs. It wasn't outside. It was beneath them, somewhere in the basement. He sat up, holding his breath, straining to hear. The scraping grew louder, as though someone, or something, was dragging heavy furniture across the floor below. Marcus whispered Elise's name, but she didn't stir. He didn't want to wake her, didn't want to explain what he'd heard until he was sure. Grabbing the baseball bat he'd left by the bed, he stepped quietly into the hallway. Each step a battle between logic and fear. The basement door stood ajar. He was certain they had locked it. From the crack, a thread of darkness seemed to spill out, thicker than the natural dark of the hall. The air carried that metallic stench again, stronger, fresher, as if the basement had been disturbed. Marcus tightened his grip on the bat, but he didn't go further. Instead, he closed the door, pressed his back against it, and listened. For a moment, silence. Then, faintly, a whisper, so soft he couldn't make out the words. He bolted back to the bedroom, forcing a smile when Elise stirred and asked what was wrong. "Just checking the locks," he lied. But as he lay back down, heart pounding, he knew something in the basement had been moving, something that wanted him to notice. The morning after the dream, Megan woke with the uneasy sensation that her room was smaller than it had been before, the walls just a fraction closer. Her porthole window, usually streaked with spray, was perfectly clean, so clean it reflected her face like a mirror. When she looked into it, for the briefest second, she thought she saw someone standing directly behind her. She spun around, but the cabin was empty. Her unease grew heavier by the hour. She couldn't shake the man's words from the previous day. "You're in my cabin." Determined to learn the truth, she sought out Helen in the library. The older woman's knitting needles clicked rapidly as Megan asked if she knew anything about cabin 743. Helen hesitated before lowering her voice. "There are stories," she said. "A man died in that room. Some say he jumped from the deck. Others say he never left at all." Megan pressed her for details, but Helen only shook her head. "The crew won't talk about it. Not officially. They scrub the passenger lists every year, but sometimes things slip through." She slid a folded piece of paper across the table. "I kept this from a cruise years ago. Same ship. Look at the names." When Megan unfolded the paper, her stomach tightened. It was a photocopy of an old passenger list, dated exactly 3 years prior. Most of the names were blurred from the copy, but one stood out in sharp, bold print. Daniel Crow, cabin 743. In the column marked disembarked, his entry was blank. Megan ran her finger down the list twice, hoping she'd missed it, but there was no departure record. When she looked up, Helen's eyes were glassy. "He never checked out," Helen whispered. "And neither did the girl who had that room before you." That night, as the ship rocked gently on the dark water, an announcement blared over the intercom, the kind that instantly quieted every conversation on board. "Attention all passengers. If anyone has seen Ms. Laura Bennett, please contact guest services immediately." Murmurs swept through the hallways. Megan didn't know the name, but her chest tightened anyway. Later, she overheard two crew members whispering near the stairwell. "She was last seen near the aft deck," one said. "Security says the cameras glitched again." The other just muttered, "It's happening again." Before walking off quickly, in the early hours of the morning, Megan awoke to the sensation of the mattress shifting, as if someone had just sat down beside her. She kept her eyes closed, paralyzed, every muscle rigid. A moment later, a cold fingertip brushed her wrist, and a man's voice whispered near her ear, "You need to leave." Marcus froze, the paper trembling in his hand as the sound of breath scraped against his ears. He spun around, flashlight jerking wildly across the walls. Nothing. Only shelves of rusted tools, jars of nails, and damp brick. But the air still shifted, heavy, alive, as if someone was standing just outside the edge of the light. His grip tightened around the bat, sweat slicking his palms. He forced himself to breathe, to ground himself, but the note in his other hand seemed to burn against his skin. "Don't look down." He realized, too late, that his gaze had already dropped to the cracked floor. The cracks in the concrete were deeper than he remembered, spreading outward like veins. And in the largest fissure, near the base of the chair, something shimmered faintly. At first, Marcus thought it was water. But as he stepped closer, the reflection shifted, not water, but the suggestion of movement beneath the floor itself. He crouched, the flashlight trembling in his hand, and thought he saw the faint outline of fingers pressing upward against the concrete, as though something, or someone, was trapped just below. He stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat, the paper crumpling in his fist. Upstairs, Elise was pacing. She'd been listening to every creak of the stairs, every pause in Marcus's footsteps below. When the basement had gone silent, her stomach dropped. The storm outside howled against the windows, thunder shaking the house like a warning. She hovered by the basement door, torn between fear and the need to see him safe. Finally, unable to wait any longer, she called his name. The silence stretched too long before Marcus's voice returned, tight, strained, barely audible. "Don't come down here." When Marcus finally emerged, pale and drenched in sweat, Elise could see something clutched in his hand. "What is that?" she asked, reaching for the crumpled paper. He hesitated before giving it to her, watching her brow furrow as she read the words aloud. "Don't look down," she whispered, her eyes wide. "What does that mean?" Marcus shook his head, unwilling to tell her what he thought he saw in the cracks. His mouth opened to speak, but instead, a violent thud rattled the basement door behind him, making both of them jump. Something heavy had just slammed against it, hard enough to make the wood shudder. Neither of them slept that night. They stayed in the living room with every light on, listening to the storm rage outside, while the basement door seemed to breathe with the house, rattling softly at odd intervals as though something below wanted out. Elise tried to distract them with nervous jokes, but Marcus could barely respond. His mind replayed the shimmer beneath the floor, the outline of pale fingers pressing up against the cracks. He knew the house hadn't been empty when they moved in. The basement wasn't just damp, or rotten, or abandoned. It was occupied. By the next morning, Elise was done pretending everything was fine. She sat at the kitchen table with her laptop, coffee gone cold beside her, scrolling through property records and old newspaper archives. Marcus had gone quiet, only muttering vague reassurances, but his silence made her more determined. The house on Granger Street had belonged to her mother's side of the family, but nobody had spoken of it for years. Elise vaguely remembered being told that her great-uncle lived here once, a reclusive man with a sharp temper. Beyond that, she knew little. But as she dug deeper, the house began to take on a story far darker than anything she expected. In the archives, she found an article from 1978. Local man missing. Neighbors report strange noises. The man's name was Harold Fry, her great-uncle. The article described him as volatile and paranoid, claiming he rarely left the property. Neighbors told police they heard hammering at odd hours, dragging sounds, and the muffled cries of what they thought were animals. When Harold vanished, no trace was ever found. The house was left empty until Elise's cousin inherited it decades later. Elise leaned back in her chair, shivering. The words dragging sounds echoed too closely to what she and Marcus had heard. When Marcus came into the kitchen, Elise slid the laptop toward him. He read the article in silence, his face pale. "So he just disappeared?" Marcus asked. Elise nodded. "And no one ever went down there?" she added, her voice dropping. The implication hung heavy in the air. If Harold had done something terrible, or if something terrible had happened to him, the basement might still bear the evidence. Marcus closed the laptop sharply, as if shutting the screen would erase the memory. "We don't need to know," he said firmly. "We just need to get out." But Elise wasn't convinced. The problem was, neither of them had the money to leave. Moving out wasn't an option, not yet. And worse, Marcus admitted what he had seen, the faint press of fingers in the cracks. Elise listened in horrified silence, but instead of disbelief, her expression hardened with grim understanding. "If he's still down there, if something is, don't you want to know what it is?" she whispered. Marcus shook his head, but Elise's words struck deep. If the basement wasn't just a bad dream, if there was truth beneath the floor, ignoring it wouldn't make it go away. That night, Elise left her laptop open on the table. She had uncovered one more article before bed, one Marcus hadn't yet seen. Granger Street house rumors of cult activity. The clipping was vague, speculative, but neighbors reported gatherings in Harold's basement, strangers arriving at night, never leaving until morning. Some claimed to hear chanting. Others swore they saw shapes in the windows, pale faces where no one should have been. Elise didn't know what to believe, but as she lay in bed beside Marcus, listening to the faint rattle of the basement door again, she couldn't stop her thoughts from circling back to the same idea. Harold hadn't disappeared. He'd never left. The decision wasn't spoken so much as felt. After 2 nights of rattling doors, thuds beneath the floor, and whispers neither of them dared admit aloud, Marcus and Elise knew they couldn't keep ignoring the basement. It had taken something from them already. Their peace, their sleep, their sense of safety. Marcus brought the bat. Elise carried the flashlight. And together they stood before the door, its wood swollen and warped with damp. Elise's hand hovered over the knob, trembling. "Once we go down there," she whispered, "we can't unknow what we find." Marcus nodded, jaw clenched, then twisted the knob. The stench hit them first, wet metal, rot, and something older, deeper, like soil turned after years of decay. The flashlight beam cut through the dark, revealing the uneven stairs, the sweating brick walls, and the lonely chair still waiting in the center of the room. The note was gone. Elise's breath hitched as she whispered, "Did you move it?" Marcus shook his head, eyes locked on the floor where the cracks spidered outward. He crouched, lowering the light closer, and Elise nearly screamed. The fissures weren't just cracks anymore. They were gaps, widening enough to see what lay beneath. Through the openings, something pale shifted. It was faint, like a ripple in water, but as Elise leaned closer, she saw it too. The unmistakable press of fingers, pushing upward against the concrete, nails scratching soundlessly. "God! Marcus!" she choked, stumbling back. He swallowed hard, forcing his voice steady. "Maybe it's a trick." Moisture, reflections, but even as he said it, a low sound rose from below the floor. A voice. No, not one voice, many. Faint whispers, overlapping, sliding against each other in a language neither of them recognized. The sound vibrated in their bones, pulling at something primal inside them. Elise clapped her hands over her ears. The flashlight flickered. For a split second, the cracks widened further, and Marcus saw something staring back at him through the gap. A pale face, too smooth, with hollow black sockets where eyes should have been. It vanished as quickly as the lights sputtered back on, leaving only the suggestion of movement below. Marcus staggered backward, nearly dropping the bat. "We shouldn't be here," he gasped. Elise grabbed his arm, but before either of them could move, the chair scraped violently across the floor on its own, dragging toward the cracks with a shriek of wood against concrete. They bolted for the stairs, the whispers rising into a frantic chorus behind them. At the top, Marcus slammed the door, his chest heaving. He locked it, then shoved a heavy cabinet against the frame. Elise stood beside him, pale and trembling, the flashlight still clutched in her hand. "It's not just the house," she whispered, her voice hollow. "It's underneath. It's always been underneath." Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but the sound from below made both of them fall silent. A steady, deliberate knock against the door, 3 times in perfect rhythm. Knock, knock, knock. The knocks at the basement door continued long after Marcus shoved the cabinet against it. At first, they were steady, rhythmic, but as the hours dragged on, they grew irregular, fast, then slow, then eerily quiet, only to start again when the couple tried to rest. By morning, Marcus's nerves were frayed. Elise hadn't slept at all. She sat curled on the couch with her arms wrapped around her knees, staring at the hallway where the door waited, the cabinet braced against it like a flimsy dam against a flood. Neither of them wanted to admit what they were both thinking. The house itself was awake. The first sign came at noon. Marcus was in the kitchen, trying to boil water, when he noticed the faint smell of rot drifting from the sink. He turned off the tap, leaned closer, and recoiled. A thin trickle of dark liquid oozed from the faucet, thick and sluggish, staining the steel. He gagged, fumbling for a rag, but when he touched it, the liquid vanished as though it had never been there. Shaken, he turned to find Elise standing in the doorway, her face pale. "I saw someone," she whispered. Marcus blinked. "Where?" Elise's voice cracked. "In the hallway mirror." "But it wasn't me." The rest of the house began to mirror their fear. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with faint groans. Door frames warped ever so slightly, their wood bending like cartilage. At night, they heard footsteps overhead, even though they were already on the top floor. Sometimes, faint whispers slid out of the vents, curling through the air like smoke. Marcus tried to convince Elise, and himself, that they needed to leave immediately. But when they packed bags and tried the front door, it refused to budge. The locks turned, the handle twisted, but the door wouldn't open, as though the wood had fused into the frame. Every window was the same, sealed shut by some unseen hand. By the third night, the house had fully turned against them. The basement door rattled violently, the cabinet sliding inch by inch across the floor as though being pushed from the other side. Marcus and Elise clung to each other in the living room, their bags abandoned. The whispers were no longer confined below. They hissed through every room, seeping from cracks in the ceiling and floorboards. Sometimes, the voices formed words, mocking, pleading, repeating Elise's name in a chorus of tones that weren't human. She pressed her hands over her ears, tears streaming down her face. Marcus held her tight, his own terror barely masked by anger. Then came the worst sound yet, the unmistakable creak of the stairs. Both of them froze. Slowly, deliberately, something was climbing from the basement. Each step groaned under its weight, closer, closer, until the cabinet shuddered violently against the door. Marcus grabbed the bat, his knuckles white, and Elise raised the flashlight with trembling hands. The house fell silent, the whispers gone, as if holding its breath. Then, with a final, thunderous slam, the basement door burst open, the cabinet skidding across the floor. From the darkness below, cold air surged upward, carrying with it the stench of decay and something else. Something moving. The door gave way with a deafening crack, wood splintering as the cabinet toppled across the hall. Darkness poured out like smoke, thick and suffocating, swallowing the glow of Elise's flashlight until it seemed barely able to cut the air. For a moment, there was nothing, no movement, no sound. Then came the scraping, a slow, dragging sound on the stairs, like bare feet across rough wood. Marcus raised the bat, his breath ragged, and Elise steadied the beam of light toward the opening. What it revealed made her knees buckle. Something was pulling itself up from the basement, hand over hand, its movements jerky and unnatural. The fingers were impossibly long, bending backward at angles that defied bone. The skin was pale, stretched thin over sinew, glistening as if damp. The light touched its face for only an instant before Elise yanked the beam away with a sob. Where I should have been, there were only deep, yawning sockets that seemed to drink in the light, swallowing it whole. Marcus pulled her behind him, swinging the bat wildly as the thing paused on the last step, tilting its head in a grotesque imitation of curiosity. The whispers surged again, flooding the house until the walls seemed to hum with voices. They came from everywhere, behind the couple, above them, beneath the floor, yet they were all bound to the figure on the stairs. Elise clapped her hands over her ears, but the voices pressed inside her head anyway, overlapping in a language she didn't understand. For one brief, horrifying second, she felt something push against her thoughts, trying to speak through her. She gasped, doubling over, while Marcus shouted her name and swung the bat again. The wood connected with a sickening crack, but instead of falling, the figure only swayed, its head snapping to one side before slowly straightening again. It stepped fully into the hallway now, and the air grew colder with each movement. The floor groaned beneath its weight, though its limbs were thin, skeletal. Marcus backed away, pulling Elise toward the living room, but the figure followed with deliberate slowness, dragging one of its distorted hands along the wall. Wherever it touched, the plaster bubbled and cracked, leaving trails like burn marks. Elise, trembling violently, forced herself to lift the flashlight again. The beam cut across its chest and froze. Symbols had been carved into its skin, deep grooves etched like ritual markings, bleeding sluggishly as though freshly cut. For a heartbeat, the creature stopped moving. Then, in a voice that was not its own but many voices speaking at once, it said Elise's name. The sound was hollow, layered, impossibly old. Her blood turned to ice. Marcus gripped her wrist and pulled her toward the front door, though he knew it was sealed. Still, survival demanded movement. Behind them, the figure advanced, whispering her name again and again, each repetition heavier, louder, until it shook the walls. Elise stumbled, dropping the flashlight, and the beam spun across the floor, catching the cracks near the basement stairs. For just an instant, she saw more hands, dozens of them, pressing upward through the gaps. The thing chasing them was not alone. Marcus slammed his shoulder against the front door, bat clenched in his free hand, but the wood didn't even shudder. Elise clawed at the locks, twisting them again and again, though she knew they had already been undone. The door was no longer a door. It was just part of the wall, grains stretching and bleeding into plaster as though the house itself had swallowed it whole. Behind them, the figure's footsteps grew louder, deliberate, the whispers swelling into laughter. Elise screamed, yanking Marcus away before his fists broke against the wood. They stumbled into the dining room, only to find the windows sealed the same way. Glass melted into the frames like trapped ice. The air thickened, heavy and damp. Each breath felt like swallowing fog. Elise pointed toward the kitchen. "The back door," she shouted, though her voice trembled with hopelessness. They ran, the whispers chasing them, seeping into the floorboards. When they reached the door, Marcus tried the knob, only for his skin to blister instantly, as if the metal were searing hot. He hissed in pain, yanking his hand back. Elise grabbed his wrist, eyes wide. "It's not letting us go," she whispered. As if to answer her, the overhead lights flickered, then went black, plunging the house into suffocating darkness. For several moments, they could see nothing, only the sound of their own breathing, and another sound, woven through it. A low hum, vibrating from the walls, pulsing in rhythm with their heartbeats. The house was alive. Elise reached blindly for Marcus, but when her fingers brushed his arm, the walls shifted. She could feel them ripple beneath her palm, soft and warm, as though the plaster had turned to flesh. She yanked her hand back with a cry, stumbling into the table. The table legs bent, sagging unnaturally, then snapped upright again as though nothing had changed. Marcus swung the bat into the wall, desperate, but when it struck, the wood vanished into the surface without a sound, swallowed whole that Elise's head began to pound. The whispers were no longer distant. They were inside her, clawing at her mind with jagged syllables. She pressed her hands to her ears, screaming, but the voices only grew louder. Marcus tried to hold her, shouting her name, but she twisted against him, her eyes wide and unfocused. "It wants us," she gasped. "It's always wanted us. It doesn't let anyone leave." Marcus shook her, desperate to pull her back, but as he did, he felt the floor give way beneath his feet. Not completely, just enough for the cracks to open wide, and for pale fingers to brush against his ankle. He kicked violently, dragging Elise with him, but the hands retreated only after scratching long, red lines into his skin. They fled back into the living room, panting, trapped. The figure had not followed them fully, yet its presence loomed in every corner. Elise collapsed onto the couch, trembling violently, while Marcus paced, gripping his bat like a lifeline. "We fight it," he said, his voice shaking but resolute. Elise looked up at him, her face hollow, her eyes wet with fear. "How?" she whispered. Marcus stared at the basement door, now wide open, blackness spilling upward like ink. He didn't know the answer, but he felt it deep in his bones. The only way to stop this wasn't to run. It was to go deeper. Marcus stood at the threshold of the basement door, bat trembling in his grip, staring into the black void yawning below. The air that drifted upward was colder than any night air could be, damp and metallic, thick enough to coat his tongue. Elise clutched his sleeve, her knuckles white, her flashlight beam shivering against the darkness. "We can't," she whispered, her voice breaking. "If we go down there, we won't come back." Marcus didn't answer. He already knew she was right. But the house had sealed every exit, and the whispers had grown so loud they felt like knives in his skull. The only way out was through. Step by step, they descended. The wooden stairs groaned under their weight, and with each footfall the air grew heavier, pressing against their chests until it felt like breathing underwater. Elise tried to steady the flashlight, but the beams sputtered and flickered, only illuminating fragments of the basement, the sweating brick walls, the rusted shelves, the warped chair abandoned in the center. But the floor was different now. The cracks weren't just cracks anymore. They gaped open, wide enough to see shifting shapes beneath. Pale arms, writhing and twisting together, hands pressing upward as though begging for release. The whispers surged louder, swelling into a chorus of jagged, overlapping voices. They weren't random now. They were speaking words, Marcus's name, Elise's name, pleading, commanding, mocking. Elise clutched her head, staggering, nearly dropping the flashlight. "They're inside," she gasped. "They're inside me." Marcus grabbed her hand, dragging her toward the chair, the only solid thing in the middle of the chaos. But when they reached it, they saw something that froze them both in place. The chair wasn't empty anymore. A figure sat hunched upon it, bound in rusted chains, its head slumped forward. For one horrifying moment, Marcus thought it was Harold Fry. The man's face was wasted, skin clinging to bone, eyes sunken deep. But when the figure raised its head, the sockets were hollow, black voids just like the creature that had climbed the stairs. Its mouth stretched open, wider than a human jaw should, and the voices poured out of it. Every whisper, every chant, every sound they had heard in the house. Elise screamed, stumbling backward, and the figure jerked violently against its chains, the metal groaning as if about to snap. The cracks beneath it widened further, and Marcus realized with dawning horror that this chained thing wasn't what had been trapped here. It was the anchor. The concrete floor shuddered violently, dust raining from the ceiling. Hands surged upward through the cracks, dozens of them, then hundreds, clawing at the surface. The chair scraped against the floor as the chained figure writhed, its hollow eyes fixed on Marcus and Elise. The whispers turned into screams now, deafening and chaotic, rattling the walls as the basement seemed to pulse with life. Elise dropped the flashlight, plunging them into flickering half-darkness. Marcus tightened his grip on the bat, his face pale with terror but set with grim resolve. "We end it here," he said through clenched teeth. But even as he spoke, the cracks split wide, and something massive began to rise. The basement shook violently, the cracks splitting wide as if the earth itself were tearing open beneath their feet. The chained figure on the chair howled, its voice fracturing into 100 echoes at once, rattling the walls until the shelves collapsed in showers of rusted nails and glass. Pale arms clawed upward, writhing in desperation, some tearing at each other as they fought to escape the depths. Marcus held Elise tight. Both of them pressed against the wall, the bat raised though it felt useless against the storm of bodies rising from below. From the largest fissure, something massive began to climb. A shape too vast to comprehend, its form shifting as it moved, faces blooming and vanishing across its surface like grotesque flowers. The whispers had become screams now, raw and agonized, pulling at Marcus and Elise's minds until they staggered, nearly collapsing. Elise clutched Marcus's arm, her voice breaking as she cried. "It's not Harold. It's never been Harold." He tried to hold it down. The chained figure jerked violently at her words, as if in acknowledgement, the chains groaning under the strain. For the first time, Marcus understood Harold wasn't the monster. He was the jailer. The realization hit too late. One of the chains snapped, clattering across the floor. The figure convulsed, its hollow eyes burning with faint light, its mouth opening wider as the screams rose to a deafening pitch. The ground lurched, splitting under the chair, and Marcus knew they had seconds before the entire basement gave way. He grabbed Elise's hand, dragging her toward the stairs. But when they reached the first step, the figure turned its head sharply, and in a voice that was both Harold's and not his own, it roared, "G.O." The basement floor collapsed. The mass of writhing arms surged upward, pulling the chained figure down with them as if reclaiming their anchor. The screams cut off abruptly, replaced by the thunderous crash of concrete caving in. Marcus and Elise scrambled up the stairs, the flashlight flickering wildly in Elise's grasp, until they burst into the living room just as the house convulsed. Plaster rained from the ceiling, floorboards cracked, and the air filled with choking dust. Together they ran, smashing through the living room window as the house groaned like a dying animal. They landed hard on the wet grass outside, gasping for air as the storm above broke with violent lightning. When the dust cleared, the house still stood, but barely. The windows were dark, the walls twisted and fractured. The basement door had vanished completely, sealed into the floor as if it had never been there. Marcus and Elise staggered into the street, bloodied and trembling, staring back at the home that had nearly consumed them. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, Elise whispered, "We weren't supposed to survive." Marcus shook his head, gripping her hand tightly. "No," he said, his voice hollow. "We were supposed to take his place." They left Granger Street before sunrise, never looking back. But as they drove into the endless dark, Elise couldn't shake the sound still echoing faintly in her ears, a steady, deliberate knock. 3 times. Knock, knock, knock.